Get everyone in their seats, and we'd like to welcome you here today for this interesting talk on a different view of China's ASAT test. I'm Teresa Hitchens, and I'm the director of the Center for Defense Information, and I'm going to be moderating today, mostly just sitting here, shutting up and listening. But what I want to do is give you some brief biographical information on our two speakers. I think you probably have biographies in your hands, but I'd like to do that first and then turn it over to them. So we have two very distinguished China scholars here today, and we're lucky to be listening to them. Both of their names may be familiar to you if you've done any work in the area of China's military programs. First, I'm going to introduce Dr. Gregory Kulacki, who is a respected expert on international educational exchanges with the People's Republic of China. He's lived and worked in China for more than 12 years, developing and administering a wide variety of exchange programs between China and the United States. Prior to joining the Union of Concerned Scientists in 2002, he served as the Director of Academic Programs in China for the Council on International Educational Exchange as an Associate Professor and the Director of the Sino-American Center for Environmental Education at Green Mountain College, and most recently as the Director of External Studies with Pitzer College, where he established a groundbreaking program in Chinese media studies in cooperation with Peking University. And next to me, we have Dr. Jeffrey Lewis, who is currently director of the Nuclear Strategy and Nonproliferation Initiative, which is a mouthful to say, at the New American Foundation. Jeffrey is the author of Minimum Means of Reprisal, China's Search for Security in the Nuclear Age. And if you haven't read it, I suggest that you do. It's a very good book, very interesting. Dr. Lewis is also a research affiliate with the Managing the Atom Project at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and a member of the editorial advisory board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Jeffrey's also the founder of a blog that's one of the leading blogs today on arms control and nuclear non-proliferation, and it's called armscontrolwonk.com. Again, if you haven't visited the site, I suggest you do. It's well worth taking a look at. Before joining New America, Dr. Lewis was executive director of the Managing the Atom Project, and before that, he was a research fellow at the Center for International and Security Studies at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, and a visiting fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and in the office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over. Jeffrey and Gregory are going to give us sort of a different presentation, kind of going back and forth rather than one speaking and then the other speak. And when they're done, we'll open the floor to questions.
Good afternoon. Hi. Thanks for coming. As you may have picked up from the bio, which is accurate, I'm not really a China scholar. My background is in cross-cultural communication, and the history of my professional experience prior to my current job is really in exchange, professional exchanges and academic exchanges between the United States and China. And the bulk of my work, even in my present position, is still focused on this idea of exchange, although it's a quite different exchange about quite different topics than I used to have been working for the last, almost 20-some years. I first went to China in 1984, was a student there for 2 years on a scholarship from Fudan University in Shanghai, went back with a sister city committee in the state of Maryland in the mid-1980s, lived there for 10 years throughout the entire Clinton presidency, and missed that whole thing. Came back, still was working in educational exchange, and then found this position with the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is important to understand the work I do so you can evaluate the character or the quality of the information you're going to hear today, which comes from the people who I interact with in China. And the reason we're calling it a different view of Chinese ASAT test is because what I have heard in our discussions with people who have some knowledge of the program itself, of the history of the program, who participated in conversations and discussions prior to and after the event, say things that do not resonate with some of the things that we've been reading that have been published in the United States on the test. So it's a different, that's why we're calling it a different view. I run a China project, UCS China project, and our goal is to sort of recreate ourselves, in a sense. We work with technical people in the main. A lot of the information in the U.S. dialogue on China comes from military science types, Academy of Military Science, Chinese NDU types, a lot of the books you see cited in some of the articles that have been written. We're dealing with a different set of individuals who are technicians. And what we try to do is to cultivate an interest among technical people in policy questions and to get them involved in discussions about technical issues, policy issues, on things related to nuclear weapons and lately for the last 5 years on space. And the Union of Concerned Scientists has been doing that for about 20 years. And over 20 years, we've had maybe 80 young and some senior technical people move through our programs. And as a result, we have a fairly extensive network in those communities in China. We do training for them, we do workshops, we do joint research, and some of the people that participated early in that process are now working their way up to more responsible positions of authority and leadership in their respective organizations, which are organizations like the Institute for Applied Physics and Computational Mathematics, the Chinese Academy of Engineering Physics, certain agencies in the General Armaments Department, the Chinese Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology, and most lately, and what I've principally been responsible for, is expanding those contacts in the Chinese aerospace community. And we have a project at the Beijing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics. In the process of doing this exchange work, we've noticed that information and advice that's coming to policymakers on some of these questions in the United States is somewhat lacking. And we've tried to organize events and activities to try to collect more relevant and accurate information and make that available. One of the things that we did was we had a symposium on space at the Beijing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics in 2004. And if you look at the slide, you can see that the person that gave one presentation was Du Xiangwan, who's now the vice director of the Chinese Academy of Engineering, where he was talking about the dangers of space debris and was making an argument for not using destructive ASATs because of the consequences in terms of the long-term viability of using space as a result of that. Our program at the Beijing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics is in their School of Astronautics, and the dean of that school, if you recognize the photo of the individual on the bottom, is Qi Fa-ren, who was the designer of China's Shenzhou 1 through Shenzhou 5 spacecraft, and he's a senior figure in the Chinese aerospace community. In the beginning, we picked debris as a safe topic to work on. After some initial research, they managed to get, we helped them with grant proposals and writing projects to get some money from MacArthur to keep doing the research. And we also had them translate a book that we did on the physics of space security. In the context of all of that, obviously we talk about what's in the press, what's in reports, what U.S. concerns are, what Chinese concerns are. And there's been all these reports about secret Chinese ASAT programs. A lot of these things I hear from Jeffrey, who's more plugged into Washington and what's going here, and he feeds me back information about the debate in Washington. And I try to get some answers to questions about certain things. And one of the things we looked at was this case, for example, of this parasite satellite. Maybe you heard about that or read a report about it. That was in the military reports for 2 years in a row, and it turned out to be, if you just do your homework and find the source, a blogger. This is an animation from the website of the blogger, and that's his name in the bottom corner there. And it was not a credible source, and we are relieved that after we published our paper on it that the Pentagon took that out of their reports on China. We also noticed problems with a report by the National Air and Space Intelligence Center on mistranslating what turned out to be a relatively insignificant article by a very minor figure in an artillery college. We don't know how that came to the attention of the authors of the report, but they actually mistranslated a section of what she said to misconstrue it. And there we have papers on that if you're interested in reading those. We also started to take a look back at some of the other reports that have been published on this question, especially on ASATs. There was a very influential report, many of you probably know, that was published by Mark Stokes back in 1999. And in going through some of the footnotes of that, we discovered that there are problems with some of the analysis. If you look here, he's talking about a potential, or saying that he's found evidence of a certain a desire to develop ASAT systems by Chinese, and he gives a citation, which is good because you don't often get those. And you can see the citation that he lists there. And so I went to a Chinese database and I actually found the citation. And it has nothing at all to do with the claim that's made in the paper about what it's supposed to represent. It's just a paper. It's actually cribbed. I met one of the authors at a conference in China. It was a graduate student who was actually copying the paper more or less straightforward from an American source on taking a 5,000 kilogram mass from, from an initial parking orbit up to GEO using low thrust technology. It was not related to the claims that were made in the paper at all. And that leads us to Jeffrey, and he's going to talk about why we decided to write the paper.
So, I mean, with this kind of background on Gregory's part, the two of us spend a reasonable amount of time in China, and one of the things that you're always doing, because everybody, you talk to a large number of people, is you're trying to evaluate the information that you get, as Gregory was saying. And so, we were particularly interested in the conversations we were having with people about what China did and why China did it, and we were comparing notes. And we were in an interesting position because we had talked to some of the same people, but we'd also talked to slightly different people. And as we tried to piece together a coherent set of facts about things that we thought we knew, things we thought we might be able to infer, and then open questions we still had, sort of comparing notes between one another, I think we were really struck at how fundamentally different the account that we were hearing in Beijing was than in Washington. And that really struck us because the account that at least that I think we were hearing was very focused on the kind of bureaucratic mechanics of things and had a lot of the sort of human elements of drama about people not doing their jobs well and organizations competing. And it struck us that this was a pretty kind of deep, a pretty rich discussion that we thought needed to be presented in Washington. And I think perhaps the most interesting thing, which is the starting point of thinking about the test, was the degree to which all of the people we talked to really talked and rooted this program and in this sort of desire to pursue hit-to-kill technologies. I mean, in the United States, we've talked about this as an anti-satellite test, and when you talk to Chinese, there's a real focus on the actual underlying technology, which could be used for missile defense or anti-satellite technologies systems, and that struck us as being particularly interesting. Everyone we talked to confirmed that the program, which was basically a long-running program that dated, was a long-running program that dated to the early 1980s, and coincided essentially with the introduction of or the development of hit-to-kill systems, particularly in the United States. In the early 80s, we conducted something called the homing overlay experiment, and the Chinese seemed quite interested in this. And the argument was that the program sort of rambled forward, kind of underfunded in the General Armaments Department, which is responsible for developing these kinds of technologies, until the aftermath of the embassy bombing in Kosovo, when there were sort of across-the-board spending increases in defense technologies, and that led to a kind of flood of cash into this program, and the flood of cash allowed the engineers and the scientists to complete the program. And you were going to talk a little bit about the literature.
Right. So we hear that this is a very old program that had its origins. We heard that it was an old program with its origins in the 1980s. And of course, in the 1980s, the strategic environment between China, the Soviet Union, and the United States is quite different than it is today. One of the things that you notice when you look at the literature on Chinese ASAT, interest in ASAT technologies and ASAT tests in the United States, is this focus on the Chinese literature and the things that certain officers in military schools are writing, or the certain editorials that appear in newspapers. And what was interesting to find out in verifying the story, so to speak, in open source literature of when this program began, is that they've been writing these kinds of articles for quite a long time. Here is the earliest I could find in open source databases in China. This goes from 1971, in the teeth of the Cultural Revolution, right? They're worried about imperialist American laser weapons development plans, which is the title of the article. And basically this is a crib, actually it's sort of a summary, of you can see the footnote number 2, of something that was published in Aviation Week earlier, about a year earlier. But if you go through from the 70s into the 80s, you can see that there's quite a lot of attention paid to developments that are happening in the Soviet Union and the United States with missile defense and anti-satellite technologies. They follow every test. They report the details on every test, so that the same sort of literature that you see now that's taken of evidence of some kind of new Chinese, alarming Chinese interest in this anti-satellite tech is actually, they've been watching these programs for a long time, as you would imagine any technical community interested in keeping up with current events and current developments in military technology would do. So it's actually, the story we heard from our Chinese colleagues about the origin of the program is borne out when you take a look at the literature from the period.
And so, I mean, the interesting thing about the test, of course, is the timing. And the people that we talked to who were involved in the decision-making sort of in advance of the test and sort of some of the post-test discussions all made the argument that essentially what had happened was the technology was mature and that there was a great desire on the part of the designers to show that they hadn't been wasting the money that they had gotten and that they had developed a sort of viable and successful technology, which if you think about it is what the General Armaments Department does. I mean, their goal is to develop technologies. And so in a way, a test was seen as a way of validating it. And what I think I found particularly interesting in the conversations was the sense of momentum that seems to have built up, that by the time all of the money had been spent and the system had been developed, they were really in a position of looking for a reason not to test the system rather than looking for a reason to test it. Then you talk about the bang.
The reason motivations, intent, messages, you hear a lot of things about that in the U.S. reporting. Well, they did this to send us a message, or they did this for a particular reason. Some intent was behind it. But if you think about it, it's a long-standing program. It's on a development track. We were told, actually, that this program, along with a lot of other programs, got a big kick in funding after the incident in Kosovo with the embassy in 1999. There were sort of large-scale across-the-board investments in military R&D that happened at about that time. And this was one of the programs that also got a plus-up in funding. So it was allowed to, it had been wandering along since the mid-1980s on a pretty steady course, and then got a boost in funding and started to take off in the late 1990s. But you hear in the U.S., for example, this is what Stephen Halley said in the New York Times when it became public, that he was questioning the decision. Questioning whether or not everybody was informed. Did the leadership know? Was this a rogue military operation? And what we were told sort of comports with this view of Jeffries, that it was really a question of, we're ready to test. Should we not test? Is there a reason? Which then makes it incumbent upon those who feel that there is a reason not to test to make their case to hold this back. We were told by a variety of different people from the party, the state, the Army, and in the research communities, that this was properly vetted. There's no complaints about process afterwards that you hear among even people who disagree with the decision. Everybody agrees that the process was legitimate and that it was made at the highest levels. They didn't say what the highest level was, and so that's left open to speculation. But they, numerous individuals from these 4 different vested parts of the system all said that all points of view were aired in the debate. It's not like anybody was shouted down or left out. That the Chinese Foreign Ministry, at least at the top levels, was in the loop. They were not out of the loop. And again, that there were no complaints about process. Now, in the aftermath of the test, we noticed there were a lot of concerns. As a matter of fact, we were solicited. I was solicited, for example, for my opinions about how China could deal with some of these concerns. One is that this turned out to be a somewhat unanticipated foreign policy and public relations problem. And they had not prepared, their system had not prepared a sort of coherent public relations strategy to deal with questions and concerns they were going to get about this test from the international community. And we were told, and this is a sort of a standard thing that you hear when you ask questions about, well, what happened? Why didn't you say anything for a week? Why wasn't the foreign ministry, have a proper, messages that they were supposed to give to people who asked? That there was a lack of coordination between the people responsible for going ahead with the decision and then the sort of lower levels in the foreign ministry that were supposed to have something prepared to go out. There actually was a document with a decision and a message that just didn't propagate through the bureaucracy, and so there was the people who were getting asked questions had no idea if the thing had actually happened or not, and responded accordingly. So there are concerns about that. Why did the policy process break down? And one think tank associated with the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party told us that there's going to be a new interagency review process that they'll probably put in place in the wake of this to make sure that these things are more carefully handled. The second one was the strength of the international criticism apparently was not anticipated by people in the higher levels of the decision-making process. And the focus of that criticism was not anticipated, in particularly the focus on the question of debris. And it's because that's where the focus is that our little project in space debris at the university has gotten us sort of embroiled in the middle of this mess on that side of the ocean. And I'll let Jeffrey talk in some detail about the debris issue.
The debris issue, for me, was particularly interesting because it's an interesting methodological question about assessing what you're told. We kind of got two stories. Everyone agreed that the debris estimates that the leadership got were inadequate, but the descriptions of them differed. One group of people said that debris estimates were just wrong, that they were too low. But a second group said that actually the debris estimates weren't really all that far off, and sort of inferred that the issue was one of interpretation. And that struck us as kind of an interesting twist, because of course, although the absolute amount of, or although the relative amount rather of debris created was really quite large, and obviously this was a tremendous public relations disaster, the absolute risk to satellites was actually somewhat low. And as a consequence, one can imagine that designers and engineers who have a strong desire to go forward with the test might give the leadership the glasses half full scenario and emphasize on the interpretation that would suggest that the debris wouldn't actually be a problem, thus leaving their bosses hanging out to dry. It struck us that explained kind of the difference in opinions we were getting. The people who thought the debris estimates were low tended not to be very close to the estimates themselves and maybe didn't have the capacity to assess them. And so instead of making a more subtle argument that it was the interpretation, they just focused on there being some kind of mistake. And that struck us as kind of a nice metaphor for the position the leadership was in, because the leadership was probably in precisely the same position, which is not looking at the estimates themselves in great detail, but just walking away with the take-home message, which actually might be quite misleading. And interestingly, as we understand it, the General Armaments Department, the research institute that conducted the debris estimates, initially tried to make the argument that the debris estimates that were coming out in the West were Western propaganda that was just designed to blacken the name of China, but that doesn't seem to have worked out so well for them.
Yeah, and we were the Westerners who were creating the estimates that were blackening the name of China. And I got an earful from a few colleagues in the General Armaments Department because, as it turns out, the project that we had at the Beijing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics, there was a young PhD student there who was working with my boss, David Wright, on modeling an attack on a reconnaissance satellite. And so they had been working with a NASA model for debris, and they had been adapting it and updating the model and predicting what would happen, how much debris would be created if there was an attack on a U.S. keyhole satellite. And in the process of doing that, just about when that paper was finished, they did this attack. And so the Chinese graduate student and my boss adapted their research to model this test, and we produced estimates on debris and estimates on lifetimes of debris, and that was published. And the Chinese graduate student's name was on the paper for a day or two before we were asked to take it down. But the damage had been done, and he was a known quantity, and he's fine. He's still doing his research, and actually there are many beneficial consequences that have come about as a result of that, not the least of which is that I did my job, which was we provided for interested parties in China an independent technical analysis of a policy-relevant question. And so I felt that this student actually accomplished what we had set to accomplish in China, and he was brought in subsequently and questioned by the people in the General Armaments Department who did the calculations about the debris. And this is where a different part of the story comes in, because it turns out that they did a pretty good job. There's not a whole lot of disagreement, it seems, on the surface between their calculations and the independent calculations. But what is significant, and I think what we need to get over as we start talking about where we go from here, especially talking with China about this test, is talking about this debris issue. Because so far there doesn't seem to be any willingness to discuss, I think because the Chinese feel that they're being attacked and it's used as a wedge to sort of force them into a difficult position. And so their response is, hey, over 50 years you've created so much debris. Yeah, we created a lot with this one test, but it's still not as much as you created in 50 years. And if you look carefully at lifetimes and risks, it ticks up the risk to existing spacecraft about 1%, which, surprisingly, to people who are not familiar with the issue, but not surprisingly to people who are, David's gone around, and we've gone around and given lectures to engineering departments, for example, about this, and they're like, 1%. It's not that much of an increase in risk.
Which is definitely an engineer's way of looking at it.
Right.
Right. Which is the sort of crucial point.
So in addition to that, in the aftermath, there's sort of general discussions that are going on now in what we would call, I guess, the defense science community in China, and also in the policy community in China, about various things related to this test. One is a clear evidence among many of the discussants that the leadership's unhappy about the way this turned out. Right? This created a foreign policy problem. They probably didn't get exactly the kind of information that they might have needed before making this decision. They need to review the debris data. They want to put in a new process in place. And what was very interesting to us, and which is the most discordant with the dialogue in the United States, is the sense that this was a net negative for Chinese security interests. That the consequences of the event in terms of China's image and the foreign policy process and their inability to deal with criticism about it probably hurt their security in the short term longer than any sort of major benefits to their security that were demonstrated by the test. Another thing that's been talked about a lot in our discussions with the Chinese is why didn't the United States say anything after the first two tests? When you fly close, get some data, do some calibrations, make another flyby, fly closer, get some more data, to make the test really useful. Why didn't the United States say anything? And some of our colleagues suggested that the leadership may have gotten the message that, well, we've done these two flybys. Nobody said anything. So I guess it's okay. Or the risks aren't that high. This may have played a role in their calculations about whether or not to go forward. And along with that, if you look at the last point, other individuals said that the net negative effects on the overall strategic dialogue between China and the United States that might be caused by this test were strong enough and a consideration enough that had the United States made a strong protest, public or private, they may not have gone through with it. Now that's, of course, in hindsight. And we're not saying that that's necessarily the case, but there is conversation about that among our Chinese colleagues. And then there's the whole question of future testing. Are we going to keep going with this program? We've demonstrated the technology. Are we going to develop it? Are we going to deploy it? No set answer. We've heard statements by the outgoing defense minister to the Japanese, I believe, right? That they are going to suspend testing. One Chinese colleague told us that actually they had communicated a message to the United States shortly after the test that they were going to suspend testing, but that was only one person, and that was not substantiated in any other conversations. But looking at it from a technical point of view, one test does not a deployed and reliable weapon system make, so we'll be able to tell if this is really important to Chinese security interests, because if they really want this capability, they're going to have to do more tests before they can use it as a reliable system that they can deploy. So we can wait and see whether or not there are going to be any indications of tests, more tests in the future.
We, as I said at the beginning, we wrote this paper because we decided this talk is based on a paper that we've got in draft form, and we decided to write it because as we were comparing notes and piecing together what we could of this sort of bureaucratic story, we noticed how really fundamentally different the bureaucratic accounts, the things that Chinese were talking about, the things that concerned them, how different those things were from the debates that we were hearing back in Washington. And if I could make a single overarching observation, it would be this sort of observation that in Washington we've tended to focus on logical rationales for why China might conduct the task, rather than sort of accepting the idea that there might be competing interests, bureaucratic prerogatives, and simple anywhere between constrained information, bureaucratic capture, and just simple mistakes. And so there were two kind of arguments that we saw in the Washington community that we think, although they make a lot of sense from a sort of logical perspective, don't necessarily comport with the kinds of things we've been hearing in China. And the first is that the Chinese test was a response, was driven by Chinese military requirements, and it was an asymmetric response to U.S. capabilities in space. And this is a very rational argument, and I think it's best outlined by Carnegie's Ashley Tellis in his monograph for Carnegie and in his subsequent survival article, where if you start from the premise that the goal of Chinese military technology is to optimize China's military power relative to the United States, then it sort of, if that's their goal, then you kind of understand this test as a contributor to that goal, and you can quite confidently assume that the Chinese wouldn't trade that away. And as I say, I think that's a sort of compelling, logical, rational argument. But one of the things we found is there's no evidence that Chinese political leaders who are, hydrologists and other kinds of technocrats are actually thinking in precisely that way. And Gregory did a little bit of work with some of the citations to some of these kinds of rationalist arguments that he'd like to talk about.
Yeah, just quickly. The soft ribs, the hitting us in our weak spot, the finding our Achilles heel argument that's popular is actually an old argument. You first see it in the Commission to Assess U.S. National Space Management and Organization, the Rumsfeld Commission report in 2001, where they talk about this idea of a Pearl Harbor in space. And in that article, they cite the same article that Mr. Tellis used to take for the title of his piece about the soft ribs. And here's the actual article, which is written again by who was a person who was a junior military officer and a graduate student at the time named Wang Hucheng. It was published in a popular journal of opinion called Outlook. And it's actually, if you read the whole article, it's not really about space at all. It's about American weaknesses, and most of the weaknesses he talks about have nothing to do with space. More importantly, they're all from U.S. sources. What this is a graduate student looking at U.S. documents, pulling information out, summarizing it, and publishing it in an article. So he gets his information all from U.S. sources. So the weaknesses he's identifying are actually the weaknesses we've identified, and he's just reporting on them in his article. And what we found is a lot of the claims about Chinese intention and strategy and Space Pearl Harbor are generally based on these sorts of very low quality sources. And unfortunately, it was in this case as well.
And you wanted to say something about the Chinese official position.
So it's possible, because there are quite a few of these sources, it's quite possible that, for example, this was a book that was very central to Dr. Pillsbury's testimony on this question before the USCC. And here's another book that Dr. Wurtzel used in his recent paper from AEI. It's quite possible that the individuals who are the authors of these openly available public source materials do exercise an influence, and that their strategy counts for something. You can't say that it doesn't. But I think it's incumbent upon those who are arguing forget about negotiations, forget about discussions with the Chinese, that they make an argument why these academics in the military academies are more important than the official statements of the Chinese premier and the foreign ministry. The foreign ministry is on record before and after the test as still wanting a treaty to ban ASATs. And if you look at the premier's statement when he was asked this at a press conference in March, he made the following points, right? That, this wasn't directed at anybody, right? Which was sort of brushed off in the United States as, well, a political dismissal, a propaganda statement. But it fits with the story we're telling. It's a technology. We've been developing it for a long time. It was ready to be tested. We needed a reason not to test it. It's not directed at anybody, right? And it did not threaten any country. And most importantly, it did not violate relevant international agreements, which it did not. This was not an illegal act on their part. It was maybe an immoral act and maybe an irresponsible act if you think about the net negative to the interests of other people who want to peacefully access space. But it was not illegal. And unfortunately, because of the tension surrounding this, numerous times when U.S. defense officials have gone over to China to want to try to discuss this in a very instrumental sort of way, they're rebuffed and saying, they allow us to raise the point and they don't formulate any response. And I think, this is my personal opinion, based on our discussions, that they haven't worked it out yet. They haven't. There's no discussion because there's no answer. There's no consensus inside on where they want to go with this yet.
None of which is to say that we endorse the idea that this was some kind of ham-handed effort to induce negotiations. If the TELUS argument is that the goal is to optimize military power, that our weakness is in space, and therefore that they're going to do this, there is this other kind of argument floating around that suggests that somehow embedded in this test was an effort to force the United States into negotiations. I should note that I actually think that's a bit of a straw man because I don't know anyone who makes that argument. TELUS cites our friend Teresa to say that, but last I checked, she didn't actually believe that. But we thought it's an argument that is worth sort of dismissing just on the grounds of clarity, because really it's the counterpart to the soft ribs hypothesis with just a different assumption about China's goals, right? China's goal is to get a treaty, so therefore they, we don't think that the story that we've heard in China really coheres with that at all. I mean, obviously one thing is that there hasn't been a kind of coordinated follow-up to the test. I mean, if this had been part of a negotiating strategy, one would have thought that we would have seen some of the elements of that negotiating strategy. And in fact, I mean, as far as we can tell, the real story is not that the Chinese thought they would get this huge reaction, but that they miscalculated and assumed that they wouldn't get much of a reaction at all. And they're now sort of forced into a position of trying to figure out what to do about all of this. And I think it's also worth noting that that's not an absolutely unreasonable mistake for a state to have made. I mean, it's not clear to me we would have demarched China if reports of the test hadn't appeared in Aviation Week in space technology. Now, you could fault the Chinese for being foolish into thinking that this kind of thing wouldn't leak, but I've certainly been at meetings with lawyers from Stratcom who argued quite vociferously on behalf of the Chinese and their right to conduct a test, precisely because of this kind of argument that there's nothing prohibiting it. So, from our perspective, what we see is a kind of bureaucratic miscoordination, failure to coordinate, and a sort of set of competing and contradictory goals playing out, not some deliberate strategy that is unalterable either to improve China's military position or to secure some kind of arms control agreement. Yeah, you're going to wrap up.
I'm wrapping up. So I think there's a couple of implications that we've drawn, at least, from the conversations we've had and the thinking we've done. One is that there's clearly problems with the decision-making process. At least they think there's problems with their decision-making process. They didn't predict the outcome. and they weren't prepared to respond to the criticism effectively. And as a matter of fact, they're still not prepared to respond to the criticism effectively. They're still working it out. The other thing that struck us is that stable relations with the United States are still a pretty high priority for the Chinese leadership. And that's indicated by the fact that almost to a person, everyone thought, in the hypothetical case, could the United States have exercised some influence on that last third and final test? Most of them felt, all of them felt, that we could have. The other thing is that international opinion is relevant. The fact that there's a pretty serious review of this debris issue that's going on inside of China right now, and there's arguments about it and research being done, suggests that they've taken to heart the complaints of other spacefaring nations that, polluting space in this way really interferes with the peaceful rights of states to use space, and that that's a legitimate concern that's being looked at more carefully, despite the sort of quick denials, which, again, I think are a result of not having an ability to talk about this yet, rather than having made a decision on it one way or the other. And then last, I think what we come away with that's really different in our view of the ASAT test is that it may be, I'm not arguing that it is, it may be that destructive ASAT capability is not central to Chinese military doctrine. That's a possibility. And I think that in the interest of avoiding the proliferation of development on both sides of this kinds of technology, that's something we at least deserve to talk about with them pretty thoroughly before we just say talking is pointless, which you hear from some of the others in the United States who've commented on the test.
Okay, thanks, guys. I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and sort of ask the first question, because I think it was implicit in what you were both saying, but it wasn't explicit, so I want to bring it out. It seems to me that part of what you're saying is that this particular test and perhaps other activities within the Chinese military space program are not necessarily fixated on the United States. In other words, that what they're doing with this program, at least with this test, was not necessarily a U.S.-centric effort, and I wanted to just bring that out and ask your opinions on that.
Yeah, China's entering its space age. And I think you should all look very carefully at the first part of Dr. Wurzel's paper from AEI, because I think he makes a point there that's not often made and that I've been trying to make for 3 years in discussions with friends about this. China's pursuing a comprehensive capability. Reconnaissance, GPS, communications. They're building their space infrastructure. This is something we did. It's something that they're considering as well. It's not that they've got this narrow focus on finding some special secret technology here. Let's talk about assassin's mace and all this sort of stuff in the literature. Some secret thing that they can bring us down with. They're building up a comprehensive capability. And that's not aimed at any particular country. It's just what you would expect a country at this stage of development with these kinds of resources and this sort of technical capability to be doing at this stage in their development.
If I could add one thing to that, I would say that, for me, the most important realization is the degree to which there is a bureaucratic structure in place that results in these kinds of decisions. And so, the people in the General Armaments Department who pursue technologies, the reasons that they pursue technologies are not the same reasons that senior political leaders might sign off on a test. And so when I think one of my biggest arguments about these kind of, this is all driven by the U.S., whether it's to get a treaty or to undermine our military capabilities, is this kind of assumption that there's a unity of purpose in China and that everyone sort of shares the same set of views about how that's going to be done. And I think what I get out of this story is the degree to which the General Armaments Department advocates for a program, and particularly plays around with the debris estimates in such a way, and then gets slapped by their bosses who suddenly realize that they've made a decision that they really regret. And so instead of having this model of a state that's well coordinated and has a unity of purpose with which there might not be much hope other than arming yourself and slugging it out, that there's actually a sort of bigger room for agency and human decision there.
Okay, we're going to open it up to questions. We have 45 minutes. You had your hand up first, sir, right there. Could you please identify yourselves before you start to talk, so?
Sure. My name's Rich. Can you hear me? My name's Richard Bush. I'm at the Brookings Institution. I take all that you say about bureaucracies doing their thing and going their own way. But there are some important units between Hu Jintao on the top and the General Armaments Department. And one of those is the Central Military Commission. Another is the General Staff Department of the PLA. And those are places where grand strategy and procurement come together. And that is where I would look for questions about whether these programs were being done with the U.S. in mind. I confess that that's probably a black box, and you may not know what was being discussed there and whether there's a connection between the strategic reasons for that. But it occurs to me that that would be a very interesting place to look.
Do you want to comment?
No, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think that's exactly the right hypothesis, that if there was if there was a very tight link, that's a place you would look for it. So, I mean, it's difficult, obviously, to look in those areas, and I don't think that they are the, they are also intervening steps. I mean, they are sort of bureaucratic institutions under their own right. But what we can do is we can look at the kind of feedback you get on the other side of the test, right? I mean, the stuff leading up to it is really hard to look into, but when you see a kind of negative reaction flowing back out, at least to my mind, that's kind of circumstantial evidence that there was a miscalculation about how the test would be perceived, and therefore a kind of non-U.S. centric expectation at the beginning. But God, if I could read those documents, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, and that's never going to happen, right? And we don't know anybody that's any remotely close to any of those places. But the one thing I want to say, though, is that just because you find a book like this, which there's so many books like this on bookshelves in China and articles that have been published like this, these kinds of publications do not mean anything about what they're thinking either. And that's the one message I would hope everybody would walk away with when they think about those things.
Mark Abreu, the University of Maryland, and what you just said, or what was just said, reminds me of the old story about looking for your keys under the lamppost, because that's where the light is. It seems to me that if you go into the U.S. military-industrial complex, ask people about what they're doing, programs that they're working on, they'll say kind of the same things. Well, the technology is here, and we want to go ahead and do it. That's why we're doing it now. And guess what? It's not that dangerous, really. It's not going to cause that much of a big impact. And there are good reasons why we need to do this, et cetera, et cetera. And then, what happens is programs that are mature and are about to be take some decisive step are often canceled because somebody higher up decides this isn't the way we want to go. One question that really wasn't addressed is you mentioned that this hit-to-kill technology has been pursued for a long time because, of course, it's been discussed for a long time. The U.S. tested and so on. And you say, well, this can be used for missile defense or ASAT, thus suggesting that perhaps the real interest is in missile defense. I know that's not what you really meant to suggest, but you should clarify that because it raises the question, why did they test it in this particular orbit, which is creating such a large debris burden? And the number was mentioned, a 1% increase, but it's actually a much larger increase in the debris burden in a certain important range of low Earth orbit. Now, also the question is raised about why a comprehensive space capability that includes a hit-to-kill ASAT. The Europeans don't seem to be pursuing that, and we haven't tested it since 1985. But I think the real elephant in the room that isn't addressed is the fact that it's not China, it's the United States that's driving the space arms race. We have tested one threatening system after another. We have tested microsatellites, which represent a far more advanced space warfare capability than what the Chinese have tested. We have made one belligerent statement after another. It's a long history of a very aggressive U.S. policy. On the other side, China has repeatedly requested that we enter into negotiations on space weapons arms control. The U.S. has said no interest in this, and has just reiterated that it's an absurd question. How can anyone even discuss this? So this is how we respond over 20 years, and then we're surprised when they go ahead and make the decision that, well, they're going to go ahead and conduct this test. I mean, they may be interested also in its actual military utility, and I agree that it's probably not central to their strategy, but certainly there are people there that must be thinking that this might be useful, and there certainly must be other people that are thinking that we ought to show the United States a thing or two.
Well, just to start off, I mean, I think the comment about looking for the keys under the lamppost is not fair. I mean, I take Richard Bush's comment extremely seriously, and I listed what I thought were two ways that we try to model that, or at least two pieces of evidence that seem to at least to indirectly address information that we freely admit we'd like to have, which is that we don't see the people we talk to suggest the General Armaments Department drove this, not some external. They weren't asked to do this. They wanted to do this because they were interested in the technology, and that would support the sort of technological account. And then the second is obviously that you have this sense that it was a strategic mistake, which would lead one to believe that their expectation about how the test would be perceived was incorrect. And you wouldn't have expected them to you wouldn't think they'd have very little reaction if they thought that this would be sort of a shot across the U.S. bow. I mean, you asked the question about the hit-to-kill technology, why they tested it in this mode. I don't think either of us think that the Chinese are unaware of the operational possibilities of the system. And there are, you can make an argument that it's easier to test against satellites, although I don't want to imply that the system is tremendously crude or anything. But certainly people are going to be aware of operational possibilities for the technologies they're developing. That would just be part of being a good advocate. But I don't think people at the very senior level have the kind of, I mean, I would be shocked if, for example, if you sat Hu Jintao down and you asked him about this litany of space complaints that you listed, how many of them he could name. He probably has a vague sense that he's not crazy about what our space policy is. But my guess is it's that, and it's a vague sense, and it's probably about one of 50 concerns that he has to deal with on any given day. And so, to me, the story we were getting about the incompetence of the highest level decision maker, whatever highest level that was, it is really one about limited information and making difficult decisions rather than it is some deep harbored desire to stick it to the U.S.
Yeah, and to the lamppost thing, I mean, you talk to who you know. I didn't set out to do this or to weigh in, and the only reason I've weighed in occasionally on this particular debate is because of the misinformation that's prevalent in the U.S. and the fact that I've read things and I think I have an ability to correct it. I run an exchange program. We're cultivating contacts with young technical people in the defense science community on China on arms control issues. That's who I know. I can't talk to anybody else.
I actually answered a lot of it. I was Colin Clark, Space News. Without sending anybody to jail, I'm curious as to whether you were able to speak with any sources with direct military knowledge, as opposed to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs types who most people seem to agree don't know much about.
No, our contacts are in the technical community. So not in the foreign ministry and not in the military academies. My contacts, anyway.
Eric McVeigh, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. I've had several conversations with contacts that I guess have a little bit of military connection, think tankers, and a couple of PLA officers. I think all of them have mentioned, and of course they're not necessarily speaking officially, that, look, we take the Taiwan issue seriously, and among the reasons that we would have undertaken that test was to remind you just how miserable we could make life for the United States if you choose to intervene in the Taiwan crisis. And also they have mentioned that they do genuinely feel threatened by the U.S. space programs and so forth. As I say, I don't know how seriously to take those comments, but I think they were offered seriously.
And I would agree. Everybody here knows there's a lot of military tension. There's a lot of different interests between China and the United States. We view each other as potential participants in a conflict in the future, and both sides are preparing for that. There's no question about that at all. From an arms control point of view, the question is how to make sure we don't get into something by accident. If you look at the dialogue on both sides, everybody wants to remind everyone of one's interest all the time. But both sides also want to avoid a war. I don't think any from China's sporting for a war, and you certainly heard that when I guess the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs was over in China. That was his impression. But the question is how to manage the relationship and the tensions that exist in the relationship, like Taiwan. And from our point of view, weapons like anti-satellite weapons are destabilizing. They quicken decision times. You heard in the wake of this plans to start developing capabilities to strike, targets deep inside China where these things might be deployed or located. So questions about hardware and development programs can increase that tension to a point. And the purpose of arms control dialogues is not necessarily a treaty, but just a way to start talking about how to manage our military tensions and our military technological development programs in a way that's not destabilizing.
Okay, we're going to go way to the back here.
Thank you. Bonnie Glazer from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'd like to offer a comment and get your reactions. One of the most disconcerting conclusions that I draw, both from the test and from your presentation, is the inability of the Chinese to really accurately predict the response of other states to their actions. This is not the first time. We can go back, for example, look at the 96 firing of missiles, and China was then so shocked when the U.S. dispatched 2 aircraft carriers to the region. I find this to be really of great concern. I think that the Chinese have a tendency to dismiss the concerns of other nations, particularly those of the United States, as being where we're instigating the China threat theory, that somehow our concerns, the concerns of other countries, are not legitimate. And I hear periodically in discussions with Chinese about steps they might take, for example, to manage the Taiwan referendum and upcoming elections and the concerns that they have. And they talk about firing a missile or 2 at targets on Taiwan. And so if we look in the future at the actions they might take using force, using coercive measures against other nations, perhaps not just Taiwan, but maybe Japan and their disputed territories in the East China Sea, or the military technology that they're developing. I think that, frankly, if they do go ahead with an aircraft carrier, not that that isn't something that they should or shouldn't do, but the response of this country is going to be, I would expect, pretty radical. And I think there's a real problem that the Chinese have with just being unable to accurately predict the responses of other nations.
I agree with all of that. I would just add 2 things. One is that we shouldn't pat ourselves on the back because I don't think we're all that great in understanding what the Chinese are thinking or doing. And I think one of the things I really took away from this is, I shouldn't say everybody, a lot of the folks who we talked about, the sort of spending plus-ups that led the program into technological maturity, pointed to the embassy bombing in Kosovo in 1999. And I confess, I just kind of sat there dumbfounded. Like, I know, but I mean, the point is, Wait. Hey, guys, our meeting. It's not that we did it deliberately, but the fact is I certainly didn't, 8 years on, think of that event as something that still played a relevant role. Right. And so I think what we have is not just the Chinese being tone deaf, is we have a real problem of cross-cultural communication, which is one of the reasons for doing a lot of communication. In terms of the China threat stuff, I mean, I think what makes Gregory's work so interesting is the fact that UCS was seen as being, folks who were not typically associated with the China threat, arguing that debris estimates were high, and then a Chinese, right, who was not so easily sort of dismissed, also making this estimate. And so I think that, that's an excellent reason to continue to fund these kinds of programs, so that there is. You had a very nice phrase for it. Was it technically informed information? What was your phrase?
Well, political decision makers need independent, objective, technical analysis of questions that come before them. That's the role we like to think we play in the United States at UCS, and we've been encouraging Chinese colleagues to play the same sort of role in whatever capacity they can inside of their own bureaucracies. Just one quick comment on not reading us correctly. I think one of the reasons this is so tough in space is because there's no other bond. We've isolated the Chinese in space. We keep them out of the International Space Station. NASA people, when they go over to China, they went over for the International Space University this summer, for example, were expressly forbidden to even talk to their Chinese colleagues for the month or so that they were going to stay there. We give them a hard time getting into visas in the United States. We've really put them to the side in the international space community. And so there are no vested other interests in this dialogue over space who might come to the table in this kind of a discussion. And I think one of the ways we could improve our ability to read each other and make better decisions, especially on their side, is to have a much more broader, more normal, commercial, civil, and scientific relationship with the Chinese aerospace community.
Okay, also, way in the back there, you have. No?
Did Bruce have one?
I thought Mr. Bukovich had one, but I
Oh.
guess not. Go ahead. Bruce? Yeah.
I'm Bruce McDonald. I'm a technology and policy consultant, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and I'm doing a study on Chinese military space. I guess I have two questions I'd throw out to you gentlemen. First, I can accept everything that you've said, but there are kind of several unanswered questions in my mind. I mean, one is, they were saying for years that space weapons are very dangerous, and then they go and test a space weapon, whether for technology purposes or not. That's bad enough in creating all the debris, but then they sort of maintain, from a policy perspective, total radio silence for what's now been 10 months. After warning the world how dangerous that is, and then they go ahead and do it, and then they don't say anything, which sort of lets everybody fill in the blank with their own mind. Why do you think they're doing that? And if that doesn't seem to quite square with what you're saying, that if they had no negative intentions, that they might have, rush to reassure people and give something convincing, not just that, well, it wasn't directed at anybody, when clearly if they wanted to, it could have been directed at anybody. And the second point is, you may be exactly correct and there's nothing hostile behind it, or you don't exclude the possibility that there could be something hostile behind it or negative. We don't know the minds of the people in the Central Military Commission, which raises the question for the U.S., well, what do we do in the meantime in a situation of uncertainty? We don't want to bring about a self-fulfilling prophecy, but we don't want to just automatically assume that they don't have a hostile intent as well. The thrust of what you're saying seems to be we should just chill out, whereas, I mean, to me it seems like we need to, the Chinese test has changed things, and we need to at least protect some options. And I'd be interested in your reactions to those points.
Okay, I'm not making the argument that I know what Chinese intentions are. They may very well be everything others have said they are. All I'm saying is that the information that's been presented to support those claims is questionable. And I have heard other information that leads me to call that information into question. So I'm not saying I know what the intentions are. I'm just saying that we need to do a better job of investigating the sources and carefully vetting our sources of information and trying to make that decision. In terms of the response and the delay of the response, my own personal sense from communicating with all kinds of individuals at various levels about it is that they don't know how to respond to the criticism. You know, when that incident in Kosovo happened, it took 3 days before they made an address to their own. Oh, it's Belgrade, right?
Belgrade, Jesus.
When the embassy was struck, it took 3 days for them to come on to television and make a statement, and then it was Hu Jintao, who was a second in charge at the time, who made the statement. And right after this happened, there was going to be a huge international debris mitigation conference that had been planned for a long time in Beijing, and they pulled the plug on it right away. People had bought their tickets, conference rooms were reserved, and it was canceled all of a sudden. These are all signs to me that they don't know how to respond, and that the fact that this has gone on for 10 months suggests that there's debate and it's not resolved. And when it is, then we'll get some sort of more definitive ability to talk about it. That's my own hypothesis on that.
Well, I would say that, I mean, I think we do need to keep policy options open. It's just not clear to me that there are, it's not clear to me that there are a lot of them. I mean, that there are a lot of direct things one can do. So, you know, I mean, gee, if we had better space situational awareness, that'd be good. You know, I don't think we shouldn't hedge. But when General Cartwright was asked what he would do about this, you know, he said there was sort of no response in space that he could imagine. So I don't know about that. In terms of the sort of question of Chinese intentions, I guess the only thing I would say differently than Gregory is, you know, there are a lot of people in China who have intentions, but I don't tend to think of governments as having intentions. I mean, governments are, you know, human structures that are put into place to aggregate preferences of individuals who populate them. And so, although individuals may have preferences, you know, what's really interesting to me is how those preferences are sort of, you know, put together and what comes out on the other side. And the sort of, you know, lack of coordination and sense that this was a mistake and that there were, you know, other affected interests that weren't properly accounted for suggests to me that you know, the Chinese are of many minds about the test, and that's a strong reason for us getting in there and doing our very best to figure out, to the best of our ability, what's going on.
You know, it's not like the State Department and the Defense Department never fight about anything, right here in the end.
Chris Byram from the State Department. Timing is everything. I was interested, since you had an opportunity to work directly with a student from the UCS China project who conducted the debris study on the impact of hitting a U.S. reconnaissance satellite. Why did that individual choose that particular target versus any of another number of other satellites that could be chosen? And as a corollary to that, now that this student has gained some notoriety, you mentioned that they may have some good opportunities opening up for them. If you could comment at least on the facts of those opportunities or give your interpretation of those.
Sure. The two individuals, the department of the School of Astronautics that we work with and the scholars who are part of this small space security working group, it's sort of an informal group, work on high velocity impact. And they do spacecraft design. And prior to their association with the Union of Concerned Scientists and participation in what we have a summer seminar every year where we bring people together for 10 days or so to present papers. This is what they were working on. Another individual was working on orbital mechanics and how debris would spread in an orbit. And so they were working on those things before we knew them. And since they were interested in debris and they were developing software models, sort of improving off-the-shelf models of collisions, and they were, you know, spacecraft designers who were interested in questions about shielding and all these sorts of issues. They were interested in some of the policy issues, and they decided to form a group, and debris seemed to be the safest and most natural thing for them to work on. In terms of the choice of the model, I don't know whose decision that was. It may have actually been ours and not the students' decision to make it a U.S. satellite, reconnaissance satellite. So I'll ask and try to get an answer to that question for you on why it was chosen. And finally, the debris team at BUAA was, they had their reputation, but it wasn't well known or well established in the larger debris research community in China, and this has sort of put them on the map, so to speak. So there's a beneficial impact that comes from everybody being aware that yes, we do research on space debris at BUAA, and we're involved. So those are the net benefits that came out of it for them.
I think it's probably worth noting that, I mean, from my recollection of looking at the debris modeling, I mean, there's nothing special about a U.S. reconnaissance satellite in the model. I mean, it's just mass and altitude. So it isn't like you would learn something by modeling that specific satellite that would be relevant to an attack that you wouldn't learn by hitting the space station or something equally politically tone deaf. Big. Oh, they just wanted to
I
do
was
with
going
a
to
lot
say
of
the same
mass.
thing in talking with David Wright, who was the senior person on the study. It was because it was big. And he wanted to see the satellite that was destroyed by the Chinese was very small and atypical for satellites that are operating in low Earth orbit. So that was as far as I know anyway, in my discussions, that was the rationale. Somebody who has not asked a question, right here.
Hi, Jagannath from the University of Maryland, College Park. You assertion that this was a routine defense development. I think there's some ways you can verify that, most essentially by looking at how the program has evolved, whether they call it a technology demonstrator program or if suppose it is a evolving defense program. Usually these research programs have interaction with academia. That's how it's done. You don't do it. You could do that by talking to Chinese experts. But then there's another way to look at it is that technology signatures, if it is an experimental test program with a purpose, you actually put up a telemetry, which you don't do if it's a defense test. And there's a pattern to the refueling. And if Americans have observed 2 such testers and they have satellite pictures, you can look into it and say, hey, there are more civilians than military personnel at the spot, which means it's probably a civilian test program. And they have a telemetry, they have an onboard destruction system. These are potent signatures to say whether it's a military program or a scientific program. And what I'm surprised is that after observing 2 test programs and the third one, that the American Department of Defense doesn't come out and say, this has been an evolving program, or no, it's a one-time program with a purpose. Can you comment on that?
Well, it's definitely a military program. I mean, it's run out of the General Armaments Department. I mean, it's, this is one of the big issues that we always have is that, China is a very heavily state-oriented economy, and so there's been a significant attempt to divest the military of a lot of enterprises, but the space community, I mean, there really isn't much of a civilian space community. I think there's sort of growing and there's more, but it isn't, the military is going to be involved, and this is definitely a military system, and I wouldn't want to leave the impression that we were suggesting that it wasn't. I shouldn't call it a system, though. That's the thing. It's a military development of a technology which has, clear operational uses.
Yeah, I don't have anything additional to comment.
Colonel Datta, Foreign Policy Association. Slightly different. Could you throw some light on the development of the laser technology in conjunction with the ASAT?
It's really you.
Well, I mean, I don't really know what to say other than the fact that I've looked into some of the claims that have been made about Chinese laser ASAT weapons that appear in the military power reports to Congress. And there was a piece, I believe, last September in Defense News by Mr. Meridian that made a claim that the Chinese had intentionally blinded U.S. satellites. We looked into this whole question of capabilities, and there's a paper that we published on our website on Chinese laser ranging technologies and the facilities that they have for that, and speculated on whether or not this thing that was called an attack was actually a tracking procedure. In other words, they were tracking it with lasers and not necessarily intentionally targeting it. There's a voluminous Chinese open source literature on the question of laser ASATs. It's long-standing, and clearly I would say that that's some indication of development programs that may or may not be underway, but I don't have any personal knowledge of any of those programs or what state they are, although we did discover in one open source going back to the time of the miracle test. It was about 6 months after the test, and a lot of what you see in Chinese literature are sort of reviews of these events that happen around the world, and particularly in the U.S. And the author, who was affiliated with a research institute out in Xi'an, where you would expect some of this work to sort of be being done, made a comment about Chinese, what's with the mirrors? It's called, yes, adaptive optics, and that they were on par at that point with what he could deduce about the adaptive optics that were used in the test. So if you read through the open source literature carefully, sometimes you can get indications of development, of states of development of Chinese technology, and that's one case where I did, but that's the only specific incidents I've come across in the literature so far.
Gregory, can you just elaborate on the fact that China is a member in good standing of this international group that does laser?
Well, you can do that.
There is an international group that NASA is a part of, and indeed I just had a conversation with one of the NASA people about this, that does laser range finding for debris and other issues. And China has several ground-based laser facilities that are involved in that research. So we know quite a bit, at least, about what's happening at those particular facilities because they are involved in this multinational, international consortia that's working on those issues.
The one thing I would say is that, I mean, if there's one sort of analogy to draw from the kind of argument that the direct-to-send ASAT is a technology-driven program, it would be that I would presume that there is a sort of equal interest in the technology of lasers. So, I mean, you know, I would be shocked if there isn't a lot of laser research. How, you know, whether that's being, you know, who's driving that, I don't know, but I mean, I could certainly see a sort of, you know, if you were forming hypotheses based on this case to investigate the laser case, one hypothesis that would be reasonable, I would think, and worth investigating is that, you know, as part of a general technological drive, GAD should be doing a lot of work on lasers.
Just as a addition to that, Don Kerr did confirm that the Chinese did paint a satellite. Don Kerr did confirm that the Chinese did paint a satellite. He did not say exactly why, and he did confirm that it did not degrade the satellite's capabilities.
And General Cartwright said they had no evidence that it was a deliberate, that there was a deliberate attack. That's just all I'm going to say. People who have not asked questions? Go ahead, John.
I find it difficult to understand how you could imagine that this program was not directed at the United States when you also say that funding for it was substantially increased after, in the Chinese view, the Americans attacked Chinese nationals as part of a war. How could it not be directed at the United States when there's nothing else worth shooting at? How could they possibly be designing this system? How could they possibly be figuring out how many do we need, how high do they have to go, and all of that other kind of stuff if it was not directed at the Americans? If it's not a central part of their war-winning strategy or their least implausible theory of victory on Taiwan, why isn't it? It's a good idea.
Well, first of all, I'm not saying it wasn't directed at the United States. I'm saying they're saying it wasn't directed at the United States. And I'm saying the claim that it was not directed at any particular country, which is the way they phrase it, is not inconsistent with the evolution and explanation of the development of the program. I'm making no claims about whether it's directed, about Chinese intentions or directed at the United States or not. It may be, it may not be. All I'm saying is that the public statement of the premier and the foreign minister that it's not targeted at any country is plausible. So I think the burden of proof falls on those who want to make a definitive claim that it was aimed at the United States to supply evidence for that. And I don't think that that's anything that anyone can do because we're not in the room and we won't be when those kind of decisions are made. So you can make guesses about the fact that we're their primary adversary, that there's a serious potential point of conflict over Taiwan, that both sides are obviously preparing for the possibility of conflict over that. But I don't think you can make a definitive claim about one particular test or event being directed at the United States and prove it.
It's never going to be definitive. No important question has a definitive answer. Questions are important precisely because they don't have definitive answers.
Right, but I think it's important to open and keep yourself open to the possibility that it's not, and therefore that creates a potential for dialogue. Whereas if you assume that you must know that it's against us, then it obviously greatly restricts the potential for dialogue, and you've closed off a potential avenue of resolving an important issue and not made use of the possibility that you're wrong about that.
Well, in terms
That
of,
makes,
you know,
That makes no sense.
oh, sure it does. Look, if we accept the Telus argument that the Chinese are dead set on launching a space Pearl Harbor attack on the United States, and that they're going to launch a preemptive strike in order to militarily resolve the Taiwan question, then what's the point of having a dialogue?
Jeffrey, can you comment?
yeah, in terms of the Belgrade embassy, which my brain is now working on correctly, you know, it actually seems quite plausible to me that one can believe as an abstract manner, in an abstract manner, that acquiring modern, sophisticated defense technologies is a necessary part of securing a country's long-term security. That doesn't strike me as a crazy notion. And it doesn't strike me as a particularly crazy notion if you're the Chinese, right, and every grade you go through, you know, reminds you that, you know, one day the gunboats just show up. And that is that kind of general desire to be strong, right, is different than a kind of asymmetric strategy to maximize one's power in one scenario. I mean, you're right in the sense that, and I think this is the compellingness of the Telus argument, that you can construct a very rational reason for the Chinese to want to do this. And you say, well, why not? I mean, one reason is because Chinese leaders have other interests. I mean, it's a peculiar kind of narcissism in which we indulge in the security community in assuming that whatever pet security issue we work on is the one and overriding interest of the state. But, you know, I mean, I spend all my time trying to convince people in the policy community to take nuclear weapons more seriously. And I know how little impact I have in that, you know, regard. You know, and so you can twist yourself into the strangest knots if you assume that any one issue is supreme above all others. And I think what we see in this sort of bureaucratic push back and forth is a suggestion that there are a lot of people who see other interests at play. And this I think leads quite naturally to Gregory's point, which is that it's worth trying to engage those other interests and rather than adopting a kind of fatalism about the thing.
Okay, right here.
Yeah, Kevin Whitelaw with U.S. News and World Report. To follow on that question, then, if the thesis that you're putting forward is accurate, which is that this was a result of a ongoing bureaucratic power struggle, debate, whatever word you want to use, what would you suggest about how we can end up influencing that? What can the U.S. do to influence where China goes when it comes to development of capabilities like an ASAT?
That's you.
I don't think that's our thesis. I don't think we have a thesis. I think the thing I've been trying to get across is that the information that we have is limited. The quality of some of the information that we use to make judgments is weak, right? We don't know what the intent is. We discovered conversations and bits of information from our involvement with the community of individuals involved with that call into question some of the judgments that have been made by others. That is the only thing that at least I'm trying to say here today. In terms of what we can do to improve our ability to talk to the Chinese about this concern of ours and their concerns over space, is that there has to be a larger understanding between the two sides we both have rights. We both have rights to access space. For example, when I talk to my Chinese colleagues, they're concerned about preserving the rights of access to space. They're just getting ready to go into it in a major way. And in that sense, the treaty makes a lot of sense for China. An ASAT treaty would guarantee that their assets in space won't be a target, of outside interference. We don't have enough information. We don't have enough contacts. We need to develop more. And once we do that, then we'll have a better grip on the situation. But I don't think we can make judgments about their intent one way or the other with the information we have at present.
No, I think that was...
And the only way you're going to get good information is when you've got a lot larger scale of engagement.
Can I just ask you to elaborate just a little further on that? He did ask sort of where does the U.S. go next, or how do we perhaps do what you're suggesting, and that is get more information, get more engaged. I mean, how do you do that in a situation where you guys are saying one of the reasons they're not responding well is that they don't have their act together? So I'm just kind of asking the circular question of what could we do to help them get their act together a little more and be able to actually discuss these things. Is there anything we can do? Maybe there's nothing we can do.
My expertise, if I have any claim to any at all, is the fact that I've lived there for a long time. I understand the language. I understand a little bit of the way the bureaucracy works. And I have a facility to bring people together in a room and engage in meaningful conversations. Part of that is picking the right people to be in the room. Part of that is creating an environment where both sides feel like they can have an honest discussion, where everyone's interests are going to be represented, where nobody's going to get burned. And the United States approach so far, I think, has been sort of instrumental. We have certain things that we want to talk about, and we want to engage them on those issues, and we want answers to those questions, and we ask. And on the Chinese side, it's, look, you've been treating us like a pariah in space since 1999 in the Cox Commission report. We're the only major space power that's not part of the International Space Station. You don't even allow our scientists to come to the United States for scientific conferences. So they're looking for respect as a member in good standing and as a legitimate spacefaring nation that we're not willing to give them, and they want to bring that into the room. So it's the way you structure the dialogue, the people you invite, the environment that you create for the kind of discussion that may, not necessarily, but may produce the kind of breakthrough that will allow us to have, maybe not to resolve this problem, but at least to have a more interesting and informed conversation about it.
Okay, the other thing I would say is, if there's one thing I get out of this, is it's not to assume a kind of position of fatalism about all of this, because so many of the interactions that we will have will be completely unsuccessful. The people involved will be the wrong people, they won't have the right skills, something will happen, so there'll be a bad atmosphere. And the point is that, if you go into this sort of cold without much of a basis of a relationship and just have these sort of few number of discrete meetings where you have something you want to get out of it, you're not going to get that, and you're likely to be disappointed, and you're likely to conclude that this is going nowhere. And so the sort of, I think the Bush administration has done a very good job of doing those kinds of discrete meetings, but what I think we need is a sort of much broader, a broader embrace across a much wider range of issues, and a kind of tolerance for the fact that for at least a while, a lot of these discussions are going to go nowhere.
We're at time, so I'm going to call, and I'm sure Jeffrey and Gregory would be willing to take a few questions individually. I don't know what time we have to vacate the room, but I assume it's relatively... No? Okay, so if folks want to talk to them, please feel free to come up and ask some questions. Oh,